My friend, listen closely. You may mistake the roar of the world outside for the sound of progress, but to me, it sounds like an ancient, forgotten melody, re-emerging in our own time. Take this volume, Goethe's Faust. If you dismiss it as a mere morality play or a simple tale of a pact with the devil, you have fallen into the most cunning trap Goethe ever laid. This is no mere fiction. It is a clinical record, a case study of an aging scholar starving for meaning while consuming all the knowledge the world had to offer. Observe the facts. He mastered philosophy, jurisprudence, medicine, and even theology. And yet, look at the conclusion. There he sits in his dim, suffocating study, confessing, "I have called myself a wise man, but in the end I have grasped absolutely nothing." My friend, you suggest this is the humility that comes at the end of learning? That it is only natural for a man to stand paralyzed before the abyss of truths that no mortal can reach? That is an uncharacteristically naive interpretation, even for you. What he suffers from is not humility. It is something far more malignant, a toxic blend of intellectual arrogance and a visceral disgust for reality, a chronic, gnawing apathy. Understand this. For decades, he has been locked within the claustrophobic walls of his study, wrestling with dead symbols. He has utterly severed all connection to the real world, that messy, tactile realm where men truly touch, feel, suffer, love, and die. Examine his study, if you will. What do you find? Only moldering books, dissecting tools, and a dust-covered skull. There is no pulse of life there, not a trace. Dr. Watson would likely mouth some sentimental platitude about the transience of human life. But I hear something else. I hear the death rattle of a mind exposed to the sensory overload of information, a mind so bloated by abstraction it has lost the warmth of reality entirely. It is a final, desperate, neurotic scream. He wielded his intellect like a scalpel and sliced his own soul to pieces. Obsessed with questions that have no answers, wandering through a labyrinth of logic, he eventually realized that his very existence had been reduced to nothing more than a signifier. The tragedy of Faust is not that he descends into hell. The tragedy is that he was so thoroughly eaten away by the poison of boredom that he found the mortal world to be hell itself. His suicidal impulses, his gravitation toward that eerie, occult magic, these were not mere curiosities. They were his emergency measures, the final gambit of a man who found science to be a dead end. If truth remained out of reach, then he would settle for something that transcended it. It was a perfectly logical, yet utterly ruinous conclusion. So tell me, my friend, looking into the abyss of this man's despair, do you see, perhaps, a shadow of your own?
Now, my friend, when I asserted that Faust was a sick man, you likely felt the urge to retort, but surely before that diseased mind, a real, tangible devil named Mephistopheles appeared. That is hardly a case for psychiatry alone. A fascinating objection, truly. But we must never forget the fundamental rule of crime scene investigation. When we encounter a monstrous phenomenon, we must, before all else, interrogate its motive. Mephistopheles. Who is he really? An envoy from the depths? A dark spirit bound by a contract? These are, at best, merely the superficial ornaments that shroud the true nature of the case. Listen closely. If we examine this affair forensically, the identity of Mephistopheles becomes strikingly clear. He is no foreign entity, no intruder from without. He is the very embodiment of the logical ego gushing forth from the deepest subconscious layers of the man named Faust. Does that shock you? Consider it carefully. Faust sequestered himself in his study, questioning the legitimacy of theology,
piercing the deceptions of jurisprudence and despairing at the impotence of medicine. What he confronted at the terminus of this path was an intense self-negation born of intellectual saturation. He, himself, poisoned the very answers that his own intellect had produced. Is there any value in living as a human any longer? When this question reaches its breaking point, man faces only two paths. He may succumb to madness, or he may domesticate the negator within his own soul. It is no coincidence that Mephistopheles appeared before him. It was Faust who extended the invitation to the cynic nestled within his own mind. That creature is nothing more than his own shadow, a projection of pure, destructive impulse that has incinerated all social constraints and moral inhibitions. Recall that famous wager he struck with Mephistopheles. If ever I say to the passing moment, "Stay, you are too beautiful," then you may take my life. This is no pact with the devil. It is a forbidden escape restriction that Faust imposed upon himself. He feared more than anything that he might one day settle for peace and find satisfaction. For to be satisfied would be to negate the entire history of the relentless intellectual struggle he had built. That is why he required the devil as an external restraint device. If he were ever to drift toward lethargy, he demanded to be dragged straight to hell. By swearing such an oath, he secured a whip to drive himself, to force himself onward until his dying breath. Even the cynical demeanor of Mephistopheles is merely a manifestation of Faust's subconscious self-criticism. The poisonous words he hurls are identical to the curses Faust levels against himself day after day. The devil does not mock Faust. It is Faust who is domesticating his own existence into the most grotesque monster imaginable. This contract is no transaction between two parties. It is an internal negotiation between Faust's consciousness and that power of negation which he abhorred yet could never release. That is why no third-party shadow exists at the crime scene. The culprit is within the victim. Nay, the victim and the perpetrator are one and the same. Do you still believe in a black-winged monster crawling up from hell? That is far too literary, far too facile, a misidentification. Look instead to the reality before us. We all harbor a Mephistopheles within our own breasts. When we lose our way, when we are tempted to drift into inertia, there is always another self waiting to sneer, to goad, and at times to drive us toward our own ruin. Faust was merely a man in whom the concentration of that shadow had become somewhat too high.
Now, my friend, here we arrive at the most vital juncture of our investigation. Many a literary critic has applauded this Walpurgis Night as the absolute pinnacle of fantasy, or a simple, devilish revelry. But let me tell you, what we are looking at is nothing less than the largest and most grotesque documentary record of mass hysteria in history. You may wonder why a man like Faust was ever dragged into such a chaotic festival. Was it because Mephistopheles cajoled him? No, far from it. That chaotic feast was an intentional short circuit of the brain. It was sought out by a man imprisoned within the cage of pure reason who desperately needed to burn away his own intellect. Let us reconstruct the crime scene. The summit of the Harz Mountains, witches writhing beneath the moonlight, monsters, spirits, and the detritus of every base desire. This is no mere metaphor. It is the precise location where Faust's subconscious, having suppressed the primal impulses of humanity for decades, finally blew the valves and released them all at once. Recall, if you will, the daily life of Faust, that dust-choked study, those sterile mathematical formulas, that rigid moral code. His mind was far too orderly,
and that very orderliness was suffocating his sanity. That is why he required its polar opposite, absolute chaos. It was a ritual akin to a powerful narcotic, chosen specifically to physically shatter his own neural pathways. Do you imagine that the witches dancing in a frenzy and the mountainside bathed in eerie, spectral light were genuine phantoms? They were nothing of the sort. They were hallucinations sparked by the extreme stress and self-loathing ravaging Faust's optic nerves. Deep within his brain, the thirst for life, which he'd denied for so long, was simply being converted into the symbol of a witch and exploding outward. Pay close attention to what Faust witnessed amidst that chaos. Right there, he came perilously close to unearthing a primordial joy, something he never knew or had long since forgotten. But no sooner did he glimpse it than a Mephistophelian sneer crushed it beneath its heel. That agonizing push and pull of contradictions is the true essence of Walpurgis Night. In the thick of that riotous din, he tried to shed his individual self, to cast off being a sage, a doctor, a man bound to righteousness. He tried to tear away all those masks within the churning herd. But the irony, the bitterly fascinating irony, is that he could not. No matter how deeply he surrendered himself to the chaos, he never stopped observing himself with a cold, detached eye. That is the most incurably hopeless curse of the man named Faust. Had I been present at that scene, I would have told him this: Dr. Faust, it is not a dance with witches you desire. What you crave is liberation from the very logic that defines your existence. In short, you seek the death of the individual known as you. Walpurgis Night was nothing more than a trial and error process wherein Faust attempted to sketch the dissection diagram of his own soul upon a bed of mud. By tearing through that frantic, whirling mob, he merely reconfirmed a single truth. No matter how heavily he draped himself in the skin of evil, no matter how wildly he cast his body into the torrent of desire, he could never escape his true self, a cursed seeker forever condemned to hunt for meaning. My friend, what is chaos? It is not the mere absence of order. It is a state where far too many orders collide until the whole mechanism locks up in gridlock. The crime scene, known as Walpurgis Night, is a brutally vivid piece of physical evidence capturing the exact microsecond when Faust's reason collapsed. He gained nothing on that night. He merely re-encountered the suspect he wanted most to flee from: his own reflection.
Now, my friend, of all the entries recorded in this dossier of Faust, the one I read with the utmost revulsion is the affair concerning Gretchen. Literary scholars everywhere have dubbed her the innocent victim, dressing up this tragedy in pretty phrases about a mistake born of love. Good God! Are their eyes entirely hollow? Listen to me. I refuse to use some vague, sentimental term like romance to describe this chain of events. What we are witnessing here is nothing less than a cold-blooded, profoundly unethical, biological experiment wreaked by an intellectual monster. Having clawed back his youth through that infamous contract, the very first target Faust set his sights upon was Gretchen. Why her, you ask? Was it because she possessed striking beauty? Was it some fateful, cosmic encounter? Not in the least. It was because she possessed everything that Faust lacked. That is to say, she was ignorant, pure, and possessed an unshakable, unquestioning piety. To Faust, she was not even human. She was merely a convenient test subject, engineered to help him claw back a rudimentary, naive affirmation of life, which he had long since forfeited. Utilizing Mephistopheles as his laboratory assistant, he plied her with expensive jewels, drugged her mother into a deep slumber with a sleeping potion, and ultimately orchestrated the murder of her very own brother. And all of this, for what purpose? To vicariously re-experience the raw passions of youth for himself. To cure the festering boredom consuming his own interior, he forcefully injected emotional volatility from the outside. Through the existence of Gretchen, he was merely observing the mechanics of how love operates. The ultimate, unforgivable crime is that he refused to assume an ounce of responsibility for the results of his own experiment. When Gretchen grew pregnant, descended into madness, slaughtered her own child, and was cast into a dungeon, where was Faust? He was dancing the night away with witches at that wretched Walpurgis Night. This temporal gap, this gaping void in his timeline, stands as the most brutally damning proof of his arrogance. The moment his test subject, Gretchen, exceeded his parameters, the mere joys of affection, and began emitting the noise of actual agonizing reality, social condemnation and crushing guilt, he abandoned his observation post and fled. Recall the scene within the prison. Faced with the raving, shattered Gretchen, Faust shrieks and begs, "Flee with me! Let us escape together!" There are readers, it seems, who weep tears of moving admiration over this, calling it the bitter regret of true love. To me, it is nothing short of a farce. He does not wish to save her. He simply wants to avert his eyes from the wretched outcome he engineered and rescue his own conscience. Yet, right here, Gretchen delivers a stunning blow, defying Faust's every projection. She flatly refuses to run. She stares unflinchingly into the face of her own sins and accepts divine judgment. At that exact moment, she transcended her status as a mere test subject and ascended into a true, autonomous, sovereign entity. And Faust? How does he respond? While her soul is granted redemption, once again, hand in hand with Mephistopheles, he scuttles away from the crime scene. Such is the true face of the great seeker, my friend. Boasting of having peered into the abyss of knowledge, he lacked even the baseline courage to look the pain of reality in the eye. The death of a single young girl named Gretchen is the unshakable physical evidence, proving just how brittle and how utterly irresponsible Faust's so-called intellect truly was. Now, my friend, the time has come to turn the final page. The long, erratic wandering of Faust's psyche draws a provisional curtain, closed by the ultimate punctuation mark, death. And Goethe has handed down his verdict, granting him salvation. Heavenly angels descend to welcome him home, while Mephistopheles returns empty-handed to the depths of hell. From a forensic standpoint, this ruling is flagrantly unjust and entirely fabricated. I am compelled to register my strongest possible objection. Why should a man who sacrificed countless others, a man who indulged in limitless arrogance, walk away completely scot-free at the very end? Goethe offered his rationale, because he was a man who strives unceasingly. To me, however, that sounds like nothing more than an exquisitely cunning alibi. Understand this. The truth that Faust spent a lifetime chasing took no concrete shape whatsoever. He passed equally through love, through power, through pleasure. Yet not a single ounce of substance accumulated from it all. What remains? Only an endless chain of insatiable desires, and the hollow wreckage of a process forever chasing its own tail. Goethe defined that very process as the radiant glory of the human soul. Utterly absurd. A process that disregards the outcome is nothing more than an engine spinning uselessly in neutral. If a murderer were to stand before a court and plead, "I pursued the act of slaughter with all my heart," should he be granted redemption? Certainly not. The salvation of Faust is no heartwarming fable affirming the dignity of human nature. It is nothing less than a life sentence, an eternal, recurring damnation, trapped within a ceaseless, hungry ghost realm of intellect. It was not God who saved him. It was the final hallucination he conjured for himself, the ultimate, supreme self-deception, a phantom he dubbed the completed paradise. At the threshold of death, he visions himself achieving a magnificent enterprise, reshaping the world. But that rushing sound in his ears was not the digging of his canals. It was merely the sound of his own lifeblood draining away from his dying frame. Right up to his final breath, the man called Faust could never distinguish reality from illusion. No, he actively refused to make the distinction. Mephistopheles could not claim his soul not because the contract was fulfilled, but because Faust had mutated into a completely self-contained, pathological narcissist, one capable of rewriting even hell itself into a narrative that suited his own ego. That is precisely why this is a terrifying story, my friend. Far more cruel than the fate of those who are cast into hell is the destiny borne by one who holds an alibi called salvation, eternally wandering the barren wastes of his own inner emptiness. He did not ascend to heaven. He was flash-frozen, deep inside the untouchable, solitary cosmos he built for himself, known as Faust. Well then, my logical examination of the evidence concludes here. Can you still stand there and call this tale a romantic story of redemption? Humph. Perhaps you can. But the truth, as always, is concealed in the shadows behind it. Once we snap the covers of this book shut, we must return once more to the reality of London's bustling streets. Will you dance like Faust within the fog? Or will you keep your eyes fixed firmly on the ground, walking step by sensible step? The choice, my friend, is yours alone.